Hello, this is Geethi from Centrist Nation, and right now we have with us Mr. Michael Kugelman. He is the Senior Fellow at Asia Pacific Foundation and was formerly the Director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
At this time of Bangladesh, of diplomatic and domestic politics, we are increasingly drawing global attention. And I believe your particular insights carry quite a weight. So it's quite a pleasure to welcome you right here in Dhaka with us. My first question for you is, the U.S. admitted about 1 million immigrants annually for the past decade. Bangladesh is amongst one of the top 10 immigrant sources. At present, we know that they are imposing certain restrictions on visa, on education, on other aspects, and they're becoming less hospitable. So do you think that the declining openness in eroding U.S.'s soft power globally, including South Asia?
As you know, there's a very extensive South Asian diaspora community in the U.S., which includes Bangladesh, and even more so Indians, Pakistanis, and some others. And this affects, what these policy changes certainly affect immigration. They also affect things like international student exchanges, because international students are now going to face more challenges coming to the United States. And, there have been a significant number of students from Bangladesh and elsewhere in South Asia that come to the U.S. So, yeah, it's unfortunate, and I think that this is something that also impacts the broader relationships at play. You talk about those from Bangladesh, those from India that might have more difficulties coming to the United States as students, and I think that the risk there is that people-to-people ties, which I think tends to be one of the more resilient aspects of a commercial relationship. It could sort of withstand shocks to the broader government-to-government side of relationships. That aspect can be hit hard as well.
With the U.S. recently imposing around 20% tariff on Bangladesh goods, to what extent are economic measures being used as a leverage in Washington's foreign policy towards Dhaka rather than through traditional diplomacy?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing the Trump administration inject geopolitics into its tariff policies, but I think that only applies to some countries, not others. It definitely applies to India because the administration is clearly trying to pressure India, top importer of arms and oil from Russia, to back away from Russia, to stop fighting in Ukraine. But this is a very different context with Bangladesh. I think with Bangladesh, what we're seeing is another aspect of the Trump administration's policies on trade, and that is to take whatever steps necessary, including pretty draconian pressure tactics, to compel other countries to better serve U.S. economic interests. And President Trump has concluded that there are countries out there that have tariffs that are too high and that they need to be lowered. And this is why I think that we've seen these reciprocal tariffs come out. The idea is to try to pressure countries to lower their own tariffs. Now, I would argue that there's something that's not fair about this, right? Because if you look at a country like Bangladesh, I think that what we're looking at, it's one of these examples of the Trump administration essentially taking whatever steps it deems necessary to secure its economic interests.
How do you think China would navigate the situation in the long run?
Yeah, the whole China factor is a bit unclear right now because, we sort of take for granted this idea that China is involved in a competition with the U.S., they're strategic competitors and so on, which they are. But the Trump administration hasn't yet articulated a clear strategy toward China. Sometimes it's suggests that it wants to continue the competition. Sometimes it's signaled that it wants to try to get along better with China and reach some type of agreement. So I think the nature of U.S. China relations is going to really drive considerations related to your question, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I would argue that China has long been a non-resident power in South Asia, right? As you know, through BRI and other mechanisms, it's been able to consolidate its footprint and its influence here and elsewhere in the region. That's not necessarily going to be affected by what's going on with the U.S., but we've also seen in recent years growing U.S.-China competition in South Asia. The extent to which that continues in Bangladesh and elsewhere will depend on how the U.S. looks at the relationship with China. A final point on this, China is dealing with its own tariffs. They're not as high as those that were put on India, but I think that China is a net beneficiary of many of these U.S. tariffs being put on countries in South Asia, because invariably these countries are going to want to look more to China for commercial opportunities. We've seen this in the India case. But in the case of Bangladesh, Bangladesh and China have a pretty good relationship commercially as well as defense. And so I think that certainly there might be a tendency on the part of Bangladesh to say, well, look, the U.S. has been a top export destination for a long time, dealing with these tariffs. While we're trying to figure out how to deal with this tariff problem, we need to look at other ways to secure market access, and China can be very helpful in that regard.
The states have imposed about 50% tariff on India. Do you think that India could possibly overcome this situation by negotiation?
Well, I mean, what they could do is essentially give in to every concession that the Trump administration wants. That would include essentially reducing, if not cutting off, energy imports from Russia. It would entail loosening up protections in sensitive sectors like agriculture or dairy. That would probably get the tariffs to go down. But India's not going to do those things. India's view is that it has already made a large number of concessions to the U.S. I mean, earlier this year, it reduced some tariffs, it eliminated some, including this one related to Harley-Davidson motorcycles, which for whatever reason has been a fixation of President Trump going back to his first term. So, and I think that for political reasons, for domestic political reasons, India's government cannot afford to essentially come back to the negotiating table and say, look, we're ready to do business. Let us know what you need us to do and we'll do it. It's not going to happen. But the problem is that India is going to take that hard line, but the U.S. side will too, right? I mean, the U.S. expects that if trade talks resume between the U.S. and India, and I think they will, the U.S. will expect that India do the very thing that I've just noted it's not going to do, and that's make any remaining concessions. So then the two sides are essentially going to be stuck. Now, there's a chance that the two leaders, Trump and Modi, would have an opportunity to meet next month if they both are at the UNGA meetings in New York. But it's a bit of uncertain as to whether, well, first of all, I don't think we know yet if Modi's going to go. If he does, it's uncertain if they would both want to meet. But that's the best way. I mean, you have this really serious crisis in trade relations and in broader relations. The best way to try to ease the crisis is to have the two leaders clear the air, but it's unclear if they're in a position to do that now.
Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister Ishaq Dar visited Bangladesh a while ago, and there has been certain negotiations which was fruitful in a way. As you have mentioned in your latest article in South Asia Brief, that Pakistan and Bangladesh are practically trade competitors, as both the countries' economic policy revolves around textile and RMG. How do you think a better cooperation could be made, and what position would that also put India into?
Right. So, I mean, first of all, we shouldn't underplay the significance of the two of them launching trade, right? I mean, we can talk about how it's going to be difficult to move the needle forward for the reasons that you mentioned that coming out of my article. But this is the first time since 1971 that you've got formal trade between these two countries. That's significant, no matter how you slice it, in my view. The focus should be on people-to-people ties. The focus should be outside of government-to-government ties. That's where there's going to be challenges for a number of reasons. I mean, we've mentioned the trade constraints, as well as the burden of history, which looms very large here, and the fact that Pakistan has not addressed Bangladesh's long-standing conditions involving formal apology, reparations related to 71. So this means that you got to go for the low-hanging fruit. And we've already seen a lot of progress on people-to-people ties, right? Even before Dar was here some days ago, there have been a number of decisions that were made involving visa facilitation, making it easier for people to go to each other's country. And most of the agreements that came out of the Dar visit were focused on people-to-people ties. There were agreements signed between think tanks in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and also related to business, to trade relations within the private sector. Now, I think India will be concerned about this, just because it's still reeling, in my view. Even a year later, it's still reeling from the shock of losing its closest friend in the region, or not losing her, but knowing that she's no longer in power. Of course, she's in India right now, and India is not about to send her back here. It's struggling to figure out what to do with Bangladesh in terms of its relations with Dhaka, but it's also dealing with Pakistan, its adversary, and tensions are worse than they've been in years following that particularly nasty conflict in May. So this is something that India doesn't want to see, but I think that for New Delhi, the biggest concern would be if we start to see defense cooperation developing between Bangladesh and Pakistan. I don't anticipate that happening. My understanding is that there have been some high-level engagements between defense and indeed perhaps intelligence officials as well. But I don't think this relationship is going to get to the point where you actually would see some level of defense cooperation. I think that's really the red line for India at this point.
India is in a position in South Asia where it's surrounded by certain neighbors with whom they don't have much of a good cooperation. And their strongest cooperation was with Bangladesh over the past decade or more. And right now, the people-to-people connection has been practically destroyed by themselves.
I mean, I do think that the election here could be significant in this regard. You know, India's government's official position has been essentially that, you know, we'll be more comfortable working with the next elected government. And, you know, India's main concern over the last year has been the Jamaat factor. I mean, that's their concern. And other religious actors who in India's view are hostile to India, in New Delhi's view are hostile to India. So we don't know what the next government's going to look like. But I'd like to think that no matter what it looks like, there's a good chance that New Delhi will be ready to try to work with that government to patch things up. And I suspect that the next government here will be as well. That's my sense. So, you know, India, I think at this point is just essentially watching and waiting. And, you know, engagement has not stopped, right? There has been high-level engagements. I mean, the foreign advisor here met with Dr. Jaishankar several times, I believe, over the last year, right?
Yes.
So, you know, it's not that the relationship is completely frozen. It's not a hostile relationship like the India-Pakistan relationship is. But it's also not as friendly as the India-China relationship is. I say friendly because it is a fraught relationship, but those two countries still engage in a number of spaces. We're not seeing that with India and Bangladesh now. So I think that India is essentially waiting to see what happens with the election. But I think that, not to be cliched about it, but you know, both India's and Bangladesh's interests are better served with a workable relationship. Because it's not going to be as like it was when Hasina was in power. But I think that, you know, given concerns about border security and economic conditions, connectivity, so many other things, it's better for them to have a workable relationship than a hostile, than a negative one.
Back in 2013, you've published like a book on Pakistan-India trade. With so much changing in Bangladesh since then, could we expect another book analyzing the situation right now?
Well, first, thanks for going into the archives to track down that publication. I was trying to figure out what you're going to cite, but thank you. I'd love to. You know, in recent years, I've written a few things, including some journal articles and book chapters on Bangladesh's foreign policy. But I think that you're right. I mean, given the geopolitical shifts that have come out in the region recently, in terms of, well, first of all, the major implications of last year's events, how that's affected Bangladesh's foreign policy, and the major shifts in its relationship with India and Pakistan. But I think that I would want to wait and see, well, 2 points on this. I want to wait and see what comes of the election before I venture to start writing that book, because I think we could see a bit of a reversion to the norm. You know, to be very candid, I think that we could see a stabilization of Bangladesh's ties with India, and I think we could see some breaks on this resurgence in ties with Pakistan. But, you know, the other point on this, I think that even amid this sea of churn, there's been some consistency. So, yeah, I know that these days, for political reasons, it might not be the right line to cite, but you know, there is this foreign policy mantra here that goes way back of malice toward none, friendship to all. You know, we know who came out with that line. My sense is that is still the default position. That hasn't changed when it comes to foreign policy, to balance ties with all the different powers, all the different neighbors. And I think there's something to be said for Bangladesh balancing ties, good ties, with both India and Pakistan and China and the U.S. for that matter. That's a bit of a different story, how that relationship will look. But I don't necessarily think we're going to see major shifts in Bangladesh's foreign policy.
How do you think the United States is looking into the foreign policy of Bangladesh?
So you didn't want to get into the U.S. Good. So I think that Right now, Bangladesh is not a strategic focus of the administration. Unfortunately, I've said this many times before, the U.S. is tending to give insufficient strategic focus to Bangladesh. When you had the major developments last year, there was a lot of surprise in Washington, thinking, wow, how did this happen? We should really have been following this, and so on. If you talk about the U.S. government, I'm not really sure there's a view on Bangladesh's foreign policy. I mean, the Trump administration's foreign policy priorities have been focused on trying to end wars and waging trade relations and trade wars, and foreign policy issues closer to home. I think maybe later this year, when I think this administration's attention will turn more to the Indo-Pacific, that's when we'll get a better sense about what the U.S. thinking is on Bangladesh. As you know, there was a call between the U.S. Secretary of State and his counterpart, the foreign advisor, a few months ago.
Yes.
And the U.S. readout, essentially said that they talked about trade and they talked about Indo-Pacific related things. It's unclear to me if the U.S. will look at Bangladesh through the lens of great power competition considerations, such as Bangladesh's relationship with China and wanting to try to reduce Bangladesh's friendship with China. There's a less chance that would happen if we're seeing efforts toward a U.S. China détente, which, as I said before, the Trump administration has signaled it might be interested in doing.
Since 2017, Bangladesh has hosted over 1.2 million Rohingya refugees, and for years, U.S. was a major supporter of the humanitarian aid, which has been currently cut down. Recent reports indicate a significant reduction in the U.S. funding and diplomatic emphasis on the Rohingya crisis. What is driving this shift in U.S. policy, and does it signal a deeper problem or a temporary adjustment?
Yeah, I mean, the silver lining out of that, as you know, is that all this foreign aid was suspended, but food aid to the Rohingya community has continued, at least for now. I'm not sure how long that's going to continue. So the U.S. did make that exception. But this is all part of the second Trump administration's very dramatic changes in foreign policy, which at the end of the day revolves around taking any steps required to serve U.S. interests, and particularly U.S. economic interest. And the view of the administration is it does not serve U.S. economic interest to be sending money overseas, particularly when it's prone to excess and fraud and so on. So, I think there's something to be said for trying to rethink U.S. assistance policies overseas, because there are a lot of issues. And this is, what we're seeing as part of this administration's desire to really rein in all of these long-standing policies that, in Washington's view today, have been harmful to U.S. interests, because it's better to, at the end of the day, keep all that assistance at home, where it could be used for better purposes. That's the view of the administration.
We know that the administration of Trump is mainly focused on America first. After the election, when the new government is elected, what is the first thing that they should focus on with the Trump administration for the foreign policy engagement?
Well, I'd say trade, right? I mean, the way that the administration looks at the world, if Bangladesh had vast numbers of critical minerals to speak of, this has been the Pakistan model. You sort of pitch yourself as a useful partner on a commercial opportunity that's of interest to the Trump administration globally across the board. I think that if the next government were to essentially approach the administration and say, look, we want to work out a deal, we want to work out a trade deal to ensure that we could address U.S. concerns, whereas at the same time ensuring that our own needs are addressed. The second part of that argument might not be taken as seriously, but my broader serious point is that this administration does look at foreign policy through a commercial lens and a transactional lens. And we have seen it's a relatively modest trade relationship between the U.S. and Bangladesh. It is one-sided in the sense that Bangladesh has sent so many products here, RMGs in particular. But I think there's something to be said for tapping into the administration's strong focus on commercial policy and trade. So I think that's definitely the way to go.
We're almost at the very end of our interview, but before I end this session, I would like to have a rapid fire round with you, where I'll be asking you a couple of questions and you would have to answer in one line or in a short sentence.
Okay, that's tough. I'll try my best.
One word to describe Bangladesh's foreign policy.
Non-aligned.
Which South Asian capital do you think that Washington watches the most closely? New Delhi, Islamabad, or Dhaka?
New Delhi.
The biggest untold story about Bangladesh in your view?
Its strategic significance.
Which South Asian leader do you believe the world underestimates at this moment?
I would say, honestly, the current president of Sri Lanka.
One thing that the next Prime Minister of Bangladesh should be careful about while dealing with the people of Bangladesh.
Retributive politics.
All right. Thank you so much once again for joining us on this show. It was really pleasant to have you here.
Thank you. It was great.